Find out, what does it mean, the flame of God on the wick of man? Okay, so we are in chapter 35. This is our third class in chapter 35. And we're discussing here the enormous power of action. Why action, from the perspective of these chapters, which is 35, 36, and 37, why action is the strongest tool. We're going to talk about Mashiach in 36 and 37, actions making it happen, actions bringing God to us in an amazing way. As we said, don't worry, this is Chabad Hasidus, this is Tanya. Let's go to chapter 38, love, fear, all of that we believe in totally. But we also believe in the power of the action, as of course Chabad is renowned for stopping Jews on the street, tefillin, candlelighting, putting enormous resources, manpower resources, financial resources into that one-time encounter that you don't get the contact information. You're not even looking for it. Probably will never see the person again. What did you do it for? Well, when you understand these chapters and the enormous spiritual power of the action coupled with the enormous power of the Jewish soul, it's worth it. It actually makes sense. It's actually worth it to put so much resources of manpower and finances to get a Jew to do a mitzvah. And what we're in the middle of discussing is, so we understand that action is very important, but why not other things? The Alter Rebbe here is using this very long, for the Tanya, very long chunk of a quote from the Zohar, the voice of the child of the Zohar, the Yanuka, to express the supremacy of action. Because the Yanuka said, as we learned in the original Aramaic, that the wise person keeps watching his head to make sure there's enough oil because the flame of God is on his head and he wants that flame on his head. And how does he keep it on his head? With the oil of actions, of good deeds, of the commandments. We said, so why not your godly? Why not your love and fear of God? We're not saying action can't be the oil, but isn't your soul holier? Isn't love and fear a more spiritual dimension of self than putting a coin in a charity box? Than putting a mezuzah on your doorpost? They seem much holier, much more spiritual. And in a sense, they are. In a sense, there's nothing as holy as your soul. In a sense, love and fear are the wings of every commandment. So surely they're the most holy part. This is what makes the commandments fly. Without love and fear, your commandment's earthbound. It's not going anywhere. As we'll discuss at length starting in chapter 38. But here we're saying, for the goal we're focusing on here, not going to make it. Why not? Because, as the Rebbe said, even the greatest, most holy, most righteous person, having such an enormously powerful soul, even such a person who's serving God unbelievably, absolutely, spirituality, holiness, cannot imagine, but that soul still exists. It still is a thing, a godly soul, which means by definition, we said there's this slight little bit of self, godly self, holy self, pure self, spiritual self, but self, maybe 1% self and 99% God. But that 1% self blocks it. You could have 100% self. You could have 1% self. As long as there's a shred of self, it can't be the oil, because the oil is consumed by the fire. The oil has no separate existence. It becomes the fire. The soul has something of an existence. And we said your love and fear also have an existence, because love and fear, very godly, holy emotions we're striving for throughout our entire study of this work. It's all about loving and fearing God, but they happen to be an expression of self. I love, I fear. A commandment, we said, is God's will incarnate. Whatever I did, my involvement is for God's will to be expressed. So this is God's will. What's itself? God's will. And that's why it becomes the flame. There's no barriers, there's no separation, there's no self. But my love has that little self of I. My fear, my awe has that I. My soul has that I. Tiny shred of an I, very tiny. But any shred is a blockage, and it's as much a barrier with that tiniest shred as complete 100% self and no sense of God at all. And that was exactly where we got to last week. So now that we explained the problem, which is of course a not correct word choice, for the reality of the godly soul. Her reality means she exists, which means there's a blockage, in contrast to the action of God's will. Every commandment is God, his will. God and his will are one. The commandment is God's will. The commandment and God are one. Remember, like algebra, A equals B, B equals C, A equals C. God and his will, one. His will and the commandments, one. God and the commandments, one. And the will of God is the force that vivifies everything, all of creation. It exists because God wills it to existence. The Milky Way galaxy, all the spiritual realities, and this shred of paper, all exist because God is willing it into existence. That God's will, which of course has infinite power through myriads and myriads of constrictions, comes down to will this paper, this shred of paper, to be with the texture, with the color, with the dimensions. This is a manifestation of the will of God. Well, I ripped it. The manifestation of the will of God. The Yerida Madregos, there's a descension of levels until it could get so small to create things, spiritual things like angels, like worlds, like Gan Edens, like Gehenna, physical things like us and the scrap of paper and the pen and all of the Milky Way galaxy. To create things that have the illusion of a sense of separate existence. That is illusionary, but we all have it. And so does my pen. We have the illusion of I exist. And we need to have that illusion to stay in the form of a person or a pen or a scrap of paper, because otherwise if we really felt our source, we would lose it. We would just diffuse into the godly energy that's vivifying us. So therefore, by deliberate design, the will of God that's vivifying the highest celestial forces, the angels that we know their names, Michael, Gabriel, and the piece of paper, it's the same force. It's the will of God. God wills, it is. God wants, it is. He wills those angels and the world we call Atzilus and the world we call Bria and Yetzira and Asiya. And as we said, the physicality of the whole galaxy and of the whole planet Earth and of every molecule in it. He wills, it is. But his will, as we progress from the highest spirituality to less and less and less overt, till we come to this crazy thing called physical, has to get more and more constricted, more and more wrapped up in itself tight. So it both wraps up in itself and it gets cocooned in layers and layers and layers. So just a bit of it filters through. Why? Because otherwise it'd be too intense and it would overwhelm us. Imagine if you pull the electrical wattage from your central air conditioning and used it for iron or blow dryer. Zapped out of existence. Well, if God vivified our physical bodies or our pens or our holy books with the wattage of the celestial world of Atzilus, wouldn't exist at all. We would just feel so intently the godliness, we would cease to exist. Sort of like this is what happened to the Jews by the giving of the Torah 3,300 some years ago. It says each time as God said the next commandment, our souls just couldn't handle it. They just were sucked into God's energy and instantly we died. And then God revived us. They revived us with the dew of the resurrection of the dead. Put those souls back in those bodies. And then God spoke again and again. Our souls were like, what are we doing in a body? There's God. Left. And God said, no, and revived us, put those souls back in the body. So imagine if that's us hearing this word of God, so to speak. Imagine what it's like in terms of the very energy of God's will. So that's why it became very constricted, minimized, turned inward, and covered over to trickle out in a way that the pen can exist and feel it has existed and not be aware that it's a mass of God energy and therefore can continue to be a pen. And the same is true for me. That's us, which means the point the Rebbe is making in all of this, many of these ideas, many of you know to a certain degree, because we really discussed them in chapters 22, 20, 21, 22. In those chapters, we did focus on some of these concepts. But the reason why the Rebbe is bringing it in here is because he wants to produce this concept of, oh, I understand this. In other words, Tanya's Chabad Hasidus. We're not just supposed to say yes, yes, yes. We're supposed to actually understand these ideas. We're supposed to digest them intellectually. So intellectually, we now understand that part of the divine design is we have a sense of self. We have this illusion of separation. It's an illusion. There's no separation from God, but we have this illusion of separation. We have the sense of self. Hasidus says, the rock says, I exist. I'm saying my pen says, I don't have any rocks at hand. My pen says, I exist. That's this illusion of self, and it's needed. It's necessary. It what maintains this to be a pen and not just like diffuse into godly energy. But that's why there's the self. And if there's the self, there's the barrier of being one with God's self, which is not so the commandments. Masha ein kain, a mitzvahs. But that's not the commandments. That's everything in our physical world, in our spiritual world, but not the commandments. Why not? Shehein nimis ritzono yispara. Because they are an expression of God's inner will. Meaning, we just said everything's God's will. Prior to that, we said, well, God and his will and the commandments one, God and the commandments one. So therefore, there's no separation. So therefore, the commandments are this oil, this combustible that feeds the flame that has no barrier. Instead, the creation is the will of God, and my pen is the will of God, and planet Atzilus is the will of God, and every angel is the will of God, and my body is the will of God. So a person could have asked me, but of course I was too polite to ask this obvious question. Wait a minute. You're saying the superiority of the commandments. The reason the commandments have no separation and no self, and therefore are the fuel that automatically transforms into the fire, is because they're the will of God. But now you're saying everything is the will of God. So what's the difference? So the Rebbe is saying yes and no. Everything is God's will. God wills, it is. The difference is, though, there's the external dimension of his will and the inner dimension of his will. All of creation is God's external will. The commandment is his inner will. What does this mean, an external will? So an external will has many levels of meaning. An external will means, for example, I want this because I want something else. And to get something else, I need to do this. I want to wake up in the morning. No, I don't. I went to bed at 4:30. I don't want to wake up at 7:30. Well, but you want to keep your job. Why do I want that? Well, because you want your paycheck. Well, I don't want that. Because you want to pay your mortgage, because you want food on your table, because you want a warm house in the winter. Oh, yeah, those stuff I want. So because you want the food and the mortgage and the clothing, you want the paycheck, you want the job, you want to wake up at 7:30 in the morning when you went to bed at 4:30. It's levels of will. I want this, not really, but I want this because I want this. I want this, I want this. Therefore, I want that. I want this. Therefore, I want that. Right? We all have these levels of will because God has these levels of will. So God has an inner desire. He wants a home. He wants a home on planet Earth. That's what our sages said 4 times in 4 different places. Our sages told us, why did God create the worlds? Because he wanted a home. He wanted a home in this reality. To get a home, he needs us to serve him. And for us to serve him, he needs worlds, he needs planet Atzilus, he needs angels. So he needs a lot of trappings to get to that point that he wants a home. I think that's why we have a deep desire for homes, because God has a deep desire for a home. So his external will is for creation, because we need that backdrop for the fulfillment of his inner will, the Jew doing the commandment to create his home, to create redemption. And that's why all of the worlds and the hens and everything else in it and all the celestial worlds are a will of God, but they're an external will. They're to get something else, to get what he really wants. And that's why you could also view an external will, meaning a will that is a more external nature, superficial nature, constricted nature, but all of which is expressing this point of, I want it because of something else that I want more deeply, and I need this for that. So all of creation is God's will, but it's all to create the stage for the Jew to do the mitzvah, for the Jew to do the commandment. And that's his inner will. And that's the difference. The ancient Hester Panim Kolam. And there, in the embodiment of his will, the commandment, it's straight. There's no concealment. I said before that to create us and the world and the spiritual worlds, not just the pens, also the angels, also all the celestial beings, also all the celestial worlds. God had to turn inward the energy, cocoon it, so just a little bit filters out, so we don't are totally nullified out of existence. That's all for the embodiment of his external will, creation. For the commandment, there's no barriers. This is his will, because that's what the commandment is. And that's why there doesn't need to be that false sense of self. It's him. That's what the commandment is. So since there's no barriers, since there's no concealment, the energy in the mitzvah is not something separate. It doesn't even have that tiny shred of self. Like we said, the soul of the greatest, holiest Jew, maybe 1%. It doesn't have that shred. It doesn't have anything. It's God's will embodied. That's what it is. Rather, it's completely fused, completely comprised in the will of God. And therefore, the commandment and God's will, God, his will, and the commandment are all absolutely one, with such a oneness that we can't separate where one starts and the other stops. It's such a fusion, it's from the inside, meaning you can take two separate entities and put them together. We do that all the time. But here, the oneness is such that innately they're one. Initially, they're one. And that's why, even though we say, well, God and his will and the commandment, but since they're initially one, when they're fused, it's just one. That's actually what we say about the potential oneness of the Jewish people. The Lubavitch Rebbe speaks about this and says that any other grouping of people, you're talking about separate entities that choose to come together. So therefore, there's always going to be a barrier because they're separate to start with. The Jewish people, even if we don't always experientially feel this, but we started off as one. And then we fragmented into the bodies of this world. So since we started off as one, when we choose to come together, we're reuniting parts of a whole. And that's what we could attain, potentially, real oneness. And that's the oneness, the commandment, God's will, and God enjoy as absolutely one thing innately. So now we're going to explain this term, God rests. We said last week that God rests where there's that oil, the combustible. And we said, well, God's everywhere. Everything is God. There's nothing that's not God. God is resting on, trying to look for another example, whatever, on my paper. I just don't want to keep picking up the same example, a pen, a paper. Well, sorry, I don't have a certain limited number of things here. So God's resting on my notebook right now. Obviously he is. Otherwise it wouldn't be. So when we say, when the Jew is doing the commandment, there's the oil and the flame of God is on the wick of man and God's resting, And what's he doing the rest of the time? What's he doing when you're not doing the commandment? God's obviously there as well, because if he wasn't, you wouldn't be. What do we mean by this term, God resting, which is obviously a term our sages use all over the place. But what do they mean by that? So the Rebbe explains, when we say the resting of the divine presence, God's flame is on your wick, what we mean is, we mean a revelation. It's always there, but we want it revealed. A revelation of godliness, Ein Sof Baruch Hu, and the infinity of God's presence, his absolute oneness, Be'ezu Davar, in whatever we're talking about. V'hainu, means to say, Hainu Lomar, She'oso Davar Nichla Ba'or Havaya, that thing is totally comprised within the light of God. It's totally nullified from its existence. Its existence right now is God's light. That then God can rest. God can be revealed on it. What type of God? What level of God? What are we talking about? God's oneness. So to unpack this term, in the Hebrew again, it's Hashra'as Hashchina, which is usually translated as the resting of the divine presence. So the Rebbe here actually analyzed both of these words. What do we mean by the resting? And what do we mean by the divine presence? What does that mean in this context? Because obviously the divine presence has many meanings, but what does it mean here? So the Rebbe says resting means revealed. Now, why does the Rebbe have to say resting means revealed? Because as I said, everything is God. God is the place. All is him. There's nothing but him. So to say the resting of God's presence means that now God is here, and before he wasn't, and afterwards he's not going to be. God's always here. If he wasn't here, it wouldn't be. So what does it mean, the resting of God? He's always here. You opened up the shades. You drew open the curtains. Now you're letting the light in. God's here. But there's a blockage that our soul energy, can't experience it. So when you draw open the shades and suddenly this beautiful sunlight is washing through your room, you didn't change, you didn't intensify the rays. You just enabled them to be felt. The revelation of the God who is always here is what's happening through your commandment. And what are we talking about here by this term Shechina, God's presence? The Rebbe says the level of God's oneness. What we've been actually discussing one way or another since chapter 20 of Tanya. We keep coming back to this theme, God is one. There's nothing but him. Everything is him. All is God and God is all. God's oneness, which means the highest level, that all-encompassing level. That's what we're talking about. When we're saying Hashra'as Hashchina, the resting of the divine presence, the revelation of the unity of God on what we're talking about here. So when the commandment is done, this item of the commandment, like last week we spoke about, the mezuzah, right? The wig, whatever that is, that item exists because God has a will for a Jew to have those boxes on his doorpost. God has a desire for a married Jewish woman to cover her hair. That's the only reason they are. That's the only excuse for their existence. That's the only reason we have these boxes and we have these wigs. So when that's happening, it's like, okay, God is completely revealed now. Because what he wants is embodied in this wig, in this box on your doorpost. It's showing that what is all is him. Because now in this world that seemingly expresses separation, that seemingly states, I exist, there became a space where God is existing. And God is existing through the fulfillment of his will. And that's the advantage of the mitzvah. So when we're merit to do these actions, we're part of this energy. And that's why God can rest, can be revealed on us. So you notice in our journey through Tanya, there's a lot of outer work, there's a lot of inner work, there's always homework. And each time we're focusing on a different aspect of how we can have all of these layers of relationship. We spoke previously about, wow, what happens when you learn halacha, when you learn Torah law. You are God home. You're God's palace. We spoke about charity and what's happening when you give charity. Now we're understanding and what happens when you do that action commandment. Does that mean I don't focus on studying God's laws? That still makes me his home. And here, this is allowing his presence, his oneness to be revealed through me. So every dimension of the work is touching a different aspect of self. We're not one-dimensional, and neither is our ability to connect to God. And each one is enabling us to have another layer of self, being absolutely one with him. Aval, but kol ma shelo batalei elav b'metzias legamri, but whatever's not completely, absolutely has no shred of existence nullified to God, anything besides the commandments, so to speak. The light of God can't rest, meaning cannot be revealed on it, because there's that shred of existence, complete blockage. The oneness of God can't be revealed there, meaning the oneness of God means all there is God. If there's a sense of self, that means plus me, right? All there is God. Yes. All there is God. Yes. Obvious sentence. And myself. Because, obviously I exist too. So if obviously I exist, I just shrunk God's oneness. All there is God plus me means it's not all there is God. There's God plus me. So if all there is God, if that's the truth, then there's nothing else but God. There's no sense of self at all. And that's why we can't do it. That's why our godly soul can't do it. That's why our love and fear can't do it. That's why our Torah study can't do it. That's why our prayer can't do it. Because all of these things are expression of self, godly self, holy self, unbelievable self, but self. So that means it's not the oneness of God. But if the resting of the divine presence means the revelation of the oneness of God, that only can be revealed where there's no self at all. That's why even that shred doesn't work. So we said it earlier. We said it last week. Well, obviously, if there's any self, it's not going to work because the oil becomes a fire. And if there's any separation, the oil's not going to be the fire. True. What I said last week is true. But now we're understanding it on a way deeper dimension. If the revelation of God we're talking about is his oneness, how could that freely be expressed in any space that says, and me? Then there's a minimization. Then there's no longer God's oneness. Now you could say, whoa, that sounds pretty intense. So a metaphor for this, not mine, a Hasidic parable for this. Someone is coming to the king, some high, noble, sensitive person who really appreciates the king's greatness. He's standing there. Somehow he got into I don't know, we could dress up the story, but I just want to bring out the point, so I won't. He's standing there in the room, in the chamber of the king, and the king's thirsty. He wants a cup of water. So does the king go over to a sink? King motions to this man to come close to get him a cup of water. And when the king is gesturing for this person to come close to get him his cup of water, the person feels like, whoa, this is the king. I'm walking to the king. And he's so overwhelmed by walking to the king, he faints. And the king didn't get his cup of water. So then the king looks around the room and he sees someone else, like a simple servant. He motions to him to come. The simple servant's simple. Doesn't exactly understand the greatness of the king. He doesn't exactly understand the majesty. He's being good. He comes. Water. Sure. Of course, your majesty. He goes, he gives him a cup of water. The question is, who's better serving the king? The first officer and the second common person? And your answer is?
The second person.
Why the second person?
He did the will of the king.
He gave him the water. So the first person obviously has a far greater, higher, deeper, more rarefied, more sensitized, whatever word you want to use, a much deeper appreciation of what it means to be the king. But he couldn't give the king the water. And the second person who doesn't have all of that fulfilled the will of the king. He gave him the water. So that's like comparing my soul, my love, my fear, higher, more spiritual ways of serving God, like Torah study, which of course is a very great way to serve God. And we focus on it a lot in Tanya. All of these are higher levels. But so there's that self, there's that barrier. And the simple action, like that simple servant who doesn't get all of this, but the will is fulfilled. That's like our simple commandments. Me, the greatest, holiest, most righteous person that knows all the Kabbalistic secrets, but we're both doing the same thing. It's that simple action. That's God's will fulfilled. So now that we understand that we're talking about the revelation of the oneness of God, we understand why, if there's any self, it's not going to work. So where could there be no self? In the embodiment of his will, in an action. Because that's not self. Why am I doing this? Just because God wants it. But tzaddik gamor. So even this holiest tzaddik, this holiest, most righteous Jew, and as we said last week, remember there's like the pyramid concept that we have within the very righteous, what we call the tzaddikim. We have greater and greater, fewer, greater, fewer, greater, till we come to that holiest Jew of every generation. There's one, the holiest Jew. We call the tzaddik, who is the foundation of the world. Singular, only one. Even he, even that greatest tzaddik, complete, no evil in him at all. Shemistabek bo ba'ava rabba, who's clinging to God with such an intense love, it would blow us away out of existence. It's unbelievable. A soul and a body can have such a love of God. But no thought of ours can grasp God at all. In truth. Because the truth of God is his oneness, is that he is and nothing else is. That he alone is. And literally, there is nothing but him. So the Rebbe is saying, now that we understand that our commandments are revealing, opening up those curtains, and we're being washed in the light of the presence of God on the level of his absolute oneness, now I understand why we can't do it without the commandment. Because, we're going straight to the top of the pyramid. That greatest tzaddik is connecting to God through his love, through his fear, through his belief, right? Very holy, 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 holy things. What creates that love and that fear? Okay, this is Tanya. So what creates the most intense love and fear of God? When we do what? What have we learned from 34 chapters plus of studying Tanya? What are we supposed to do to create a love of God? Don't feel put on the spot. What are we supposed to do to create a love of God? How do we create a love of God?
I'd study by belittling ourselves.
What enables you to nullify yourself? How did you start nullifying yourself? What brought you to nullify yourself to God? So Dottie is very, very intuitive, and she sensed all this. But for everyone else that's not as spiritually intuitive, what gets them to nullify themselves? Contemplate. Thank you. Someone sent me a private chat. She didn't want to show off in front of the class. Contemplate. What are you contemplating? To contemplate, what do you need to do first? What's the subject you're contemplating? Understanding how great God is. What enables us to understand how great God is? What do we have to do? What helps us? Besides being very intuitive like Dottie. The greatness of God, someone's saying. How do you know what the greatness of God is? What are you supposed to do to know the greatness of God and to contemplate the greatness of God? What's a really good thing to do? That's our road to love and fear of God. Classical Tanya. Let me phrase the question differently. Study and learn. We study, we learn, and we contemplate, and we internalize the greatness of God. And as we're internalizing the greatness of God, we start creating a love and an awe. That is the classical road to cleave to God and to achieve what Dottie correctly said. All of that's leading to our nullification. Now, some people just intuitively have this sense of like, whoa, what am I? But thank God I am, because I'm a godly soul. But then we got to trudge. We get those flashes. I think there's like the flash, and then there's the climb, the crawl. So we can get those flashes, like Dottie had her flash, but then you take that flash and you start working with it. And maybe that flash inspires you to open up a few books or open up your internet and do some research and study and learn and contemplate and meditate and feel God's greatness and feel his power and feel his infinity and understand he's right here. And all of that brings you to love, which means that the core tool you're using to love and fear God is what part of yourself? Which faculty of self is the key here to truly connect to God, nullify yourself to God, love God, fear God, believe in God? What part of self are you using?
Maya.
Your thought, your mind, exactly. Your intellect, exactly. That's the road. Our mind, our thought, our intellect, that's the tool. It's very interesting because before the Alter Rebbe gave the world the Tanya, there was definitely some suspicion on the mind, some hesitation. The mind is very cold. That is absolutely true. There's nothing as cold as our mind. Our hearts are warm. Our hearts are alive. Minds can be very cold. They can be skeptical, cynical. That's true. But the mind is the most direct road to our soul. So we use the mind and we fill it with godliness to start the fires from the mind to the heart. Our goal, by the way, I know like some of us, we can feel like, whoa, Tanya, this is really heavy duty philosophy, theology. Tanya was written as the everyman journey to having a relationship with God. Tanya is about you and God becoming one. And therefore, Tanya is full of how you're going to have an emotional connection. Because human beings are wired. We all know this because we're human. We're studying the human being. Oh, we know it. We know this. If we feel it, we do it. If we understand it and we know it, maybe. But if we feel it, we do it. The Alter Rebbe is saying the most direct way to reach that soul, to control that heart, to feel is your mind. So through your mind to your heart, to your belief and nullification and love and fear and absolute service of God. So it all begins with the mind. So this greatest righteous, holy tzaddik, this greatest person who so much loves God and has such awe of God and is serving him completely and totally nullified. It all started with his mind, with his intellect, with studying and learning and contemplating and digesting and internalizing. Right, that's the road. Well, guess what? The Alter Rebbe quoted Kabbalistically in Aramaic, Leis machshava tfesa klal. No thought of ours can grasp God at all. So if all of our divine service is emanating from our intellect, by definition, we're never going to get it because our intellect can't grasp it. Because how can intellect grasp that which is beyond intellect? God's not within that box called reason. So how can my mind fathom supra-rational? How can my mind within a box of time and space fathom beyond time, beyond space? How can my mind that knows limits and chews everything down and dissects it into parts grasp that there are no parts, that it's only one, him, that's it? And I can't, my mind reached the point where it can't. Right, but a mitzvah can. So if you want to go on the wings of your spiritual development that we work a lot on in Tanya, and your developed emotions that we totally focus on in Tanya, to create those wings and for your commandments that we so much want to achieve, if you go that road, the Rebbe is saying, and that's your road, you can't get God. You can't get God in his infinity because thought can't grasp him. He's beyond thought. So how could your thoughts ever create something that's going to hold him? Your commandments can. Your commandments are your actions. Your commandments aren't coming from that study and meditate and contemplate and internalize and digest. You're just doing it. And that's what we said, that simplest person and that greatest, most refined, rarefied spiritual person, they both have the same ability to put a coin in a charity box, to put a mezuzah on their door, to eat food that's kosher, to any of the other mitzvahs, any of the other commandments, to light the candles of the Shabbos, to put on the tefillin. The greatest Jew, the simplest Jew. Well, the greatest Jew knows what he's doing, and he knows esoteric meaning, and he has such love and fear. All that's true, and all that's amazing, and all that I wish we all had, and God willing, by Mashiach we will. None of that's enabling you to get God, because that can't get God. But the commandment, that, and the simple Jew doing it, you're both on the same page. and you both get God. And if so, so the one who's doing exactly what we all want to do, and we're all striving to do, the one who truly loves God, well, I love, he's a thing, a very spiritual thing, a very holy thing, but an I on some very, very rarefied level. Below Ephes, he's not nothing. Well, no thought of a human is going to grasp God at all. So everything produced by your thoughts, like your love, like your fear, like your belief, like your nullification, none of that's going to grasp God at all. And therefore, the infinity of God, the oneness of God, where there's nothing else but him. So there's no plus me. It can't rest there because there's that very, very subtle I. And therefore, God's oneness can't be revealed at all. Rather, what can grasp God, because it's one with God, is the fulfillment of the actions, which are literally God, his will, these commandments. One, lishum hesterpan, without any concealment at all. So as I said last week, I think when we're learning these concepts, it's so empowering, because sometimes we could feel like we can learn a lot of holy things and we can try and we could strive, but I don't really know if my prayers are exactly what they're supposed to be. And I don't really know if my Torah study, I'm really getting it. And I don't really know if I'm creating that degree of love and fear that I wish. But this, the Rebbe is saying, doing the action, eating the food that's kosher, having that mezuzah, putting on that tefillin, lighting those Shabbos candles, giving that charity. Yeah, we can and do those things. And each time we are, the drapes are open. The sunlight of God's presence is pouring in, that there's nothing else but him. And it's so accessible. And that was, as far as we're going to stop now, but we did quite a lot in the thoughts of chapter 35.
What would you describe our homework as trying to do actions, thinking that you're just connecting with Hashem? Like this is just,
exactly feel that. Do the action and appreciate the action.
Like this is my connection.
This is such a ability, like, wow, what's happening now? Of course, if I felt it, I would cease to exist. So I'm protected from feeling it, but it's happening. This is what my soul is experiencing. All the windows are open, all the shades are open, all the drapes are open. I'm getting that intensity that there's nothing but God through this action. Wow, let me go do another one. Like that, the desire for it. Because if you really get what it is, you want it and you appreciate it. That's what I think is the takeaway.